There's something uniquely vulnerable about sleeping under the stars. Removed from the safety of civilization and immersed in nature's vast silence, even the faintest sound can awaken a primal fear, one rooted in our most ancient instincts. In this episode of Cass Mystery, we delve into 3 unsettling tales of camping trips gone horribly wrong. These are not just ghost stories, but accounts that twist the fabric of reality, blur the line between the natural and the unnatural, and leave behind lingering questions with no satisfying answers. Buckle up, because after this, you may never see camping the same way again. The disappearance in Tuba Forest. Matthew was 16 when he was invited by his childhood friend Kelly and her father Ryan to join them on a summer camping trip in the remote wilderness north of Tuba City, Arizona. Ryan owned a rustic, off-grid cabin near a string of scenic lakes and planned a multi-day backpacking adventure into the forest. For Matthew, who had been drowning in grief after the death of a close friend, it was meant to be a healing escape. The trio set out on a scenic trail that snaked through pine forests and rocky ridges. The first campsite, beside a still alpine lake, offered serenity that Matthew hadn't felt in months. They fished, shared stories, and fell asleep beneath a canvas of stars. But the calm didn't last. On the return hike to the cabin before heading to a second site, they stopped by a cluster of berry bushes. Ryan stepped away to relieve himself, just a few paces behind a pine tree, and vanished. The forest went unnaturally silent. No birds, no breeze. Kelly called for her father, but there was no answer. When they checked, there were no footprints, no broken twigs, no sign Ryan had ever stood there. Panic surged. They searched for hours but found nothing. Deciding to use the truck radio back at the cabin to call for help, they were soon caught in a flash storm. As thunder rolled and rain poured, they waited beneath a tarp. When the sky cleared, they stepped into a sun-drenched clearing, only to witness a herd of deer that didn't move like deer. Their limbs twitched mechanically. Their eyes held too much white. And their feet, Matthew realized in horror, were not hooves, but something more canine. One of the creatures locked eyes with him, and he felt his body scream with ancient fear. They ran. At the cabin, they called the Forest Service. Rescue searches turned up nothing for weeks. Months later, Ryan's remains were found on a trail miles from the last known location. How he got there remains unexplained. But neither Matthew nor Kelly, now his wife, have spoken about the deer ever again. Echoes in the dark. A solo camper whose name was never released publicly pitched his tent in a remote part of Michigan, hoping for a peaceful night away from civilization. Around 11:30 p.m., he heard a voice calling faintly from the woods. "Please help." It sounded female and oddly distant. Concerned, he called local police, only to be told something he never expected. "Do not respond." Baffled and unnerved, he asked why. The officer said simply, "It's not what you think. If you hear it again, don't go near it." At midnight, he heard it again, this time closer. "Help, please." Then another voice followed, male, commanding, almost growling. "Quiet, no one is coming." The contrast chilled him. He called the police again. They were alarmed. They told him the voices were coming from the same source and that he needed to pack and leave immediately. But driven by guilt and a sense of duty, he walked into the forest. The voices stopped. There was no one there. No cries, no whispers, just silence. He returned to his tent and left the site at dawn, unnerved but unconvinced. A week later, he heard the same pleading voice inside his own home, coming from a closet. He moved out the next day, the thing that laughed like Todd. Amy, her husband Don, her brother Todd, and a friend camped at a spot in Michigan they jokingly called the Spider Spot, named after a massive spider infestation during a previous camping trip. This time it was supposed to be a nostalgic weekend getaway. No phones, just beer and bonfires. At around 1:30 a.m., while the fire was dying, they heard laughter in the woods. It sounded human, playful. Todd, in his usual boisterous style, shouted out, "Got any more beer?" A moment later, they heard running. Then a voice mimicked Todd's call, but off, slightly distorted, robotic. "What the hell?" Don whispered. Everyone fell silent. Amy, already uneasy, begged to leave, but the others laughed it off. That night, as everyone settled into their tents, Todd shook his friend awake. "Dude, listen." A voice just outside the tent whispered, "I'm sleeping in your tent tonight." It sounded exactly like Todd, but Todd was inside the tent. Everyone bolted, sprinting through the trees, not daring to look back. They drove off in a panic, but that wasn't the end. Back home, Todd began hearing whispering at night, software imitating his voice, saying things only he'd said at the campsite. To this day, he sleeps with lights on, and no one will camp at the Spider Spot again. These stories serve as eerie reminders of how quickly a peaceful retreat can become a descent into madness and fear. Whether it's vanishing without a trace, voices that mimic and deceive, or creatures that wear the skin of the familiar, something is lurking out there, just beyond the firelight. So next time you're deep in the woods and hear something that doesn't sound quite right, maybe it's better not to look. This has been Cass Mystery. Sleep tight, campers.